सहनावतु सहनो भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै। ओम शांति शांति शांति। May Brahman protect us both. May He nourish us both. May we work together with vigor. May our study make us illumined. May there be no dislike between us. Om peace, peace, peace.
ज्ञान भक्ति प्रशान्ति वितरितुमवतीर्णम् ज्ञान भक्ति प्रशान्ति प्रणय गलित चित्तम् जीव दुःखासहिष्णुम् प्रणय गलित चित्तम् जीव दुःखासहिष्णुम् धृत सहज समाधिम् चिन्मयम् कोमलांगम् धृत सहज समाधिम् चिन्मयम् कोमलांगम् विमल परमहंसम् रामकृष्णं भजामः विमल परमहंसम् रामकृष्णं भजामः रामकृष्णं भजामः रामकृष्णं भजामः.
I am reading from the book Sri Ramakrishna, the Great Master, written by Swami Vidyanathananda, the direct disciple of the Master. The chapter is Grace bestowed on Mathur Nath Vishwas. Rani Rashmani had no son, but had 4 daughters. Mathur Babu married the third, and after her death, the youngest daughter. The intelligent Rani fixed and marked in her lifetime the share of the estate for each of the sons-in-law, lest there should arise a dispute amongst themselves over the estate. One day, after the estate had been thus divided, Mathur Babu's wife, or as she was known in the family, the third mistress, went to bathe in a pond in another share of the estate, saw the luxuriant growth of the green shushni there, plucked some and brought it away with her. It was the master only who saw her do it. As soon as he saw her doing that, he was extremely worried. The third mistress, thought the master, has taken another's property without asking for it. It is immoral. She did not think it an act of theft to take another's property without her knowledge. And again, why should she covet another's property? He was thinking thus when he met that daughter of the Rani to whose share that said pond had fallen. The master narrated to her immediately the whole incident. She could not control her laughter on hearing it, and on seeing that serious mood of the master, as if the third mistress had acted very wrongly, she said humorously, the third mistress acted very wrongly, father." Just at that time, the third mistress also happened to come there. She also said, jokingly, when she knew the reason of her sister's laughter, "Father, is it proper for you to expose me like this? I stole the greens and secretly took it away, lest she should see it. You have thus put me out of countenance." Saying so, the two sisters burst into a roar of laughter. The master then said, I don't know your worldly ways, but when the property has been divided, it is not good to take anything without the knowledge of the owner. This is why I told her all this, so that she might know it and settle matters as she liked. The daughters of the Rani began to laugh all the more at his words, and thought how frank and naive her father was. Innocent. We'll have a short period of meditation. On behalf of Vedanta Society of Toronto, I would like to welcome Mohan Maharaj or Swami Vidyanathananda ji to kindly accept his seat here. A brief introduction of Mohan Maharaj. Mohan Mitra joined the PhD program in mathematics at UC Berkeley with Andrew Casson as his advisor. He received the Earl C. Anthony Fellowship, UC Berkeley in 1992-1993 and the prestigious Alfred P. Sloan Doctoral Dissertation Fellowship for 1996-1997. After earning a doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley in 1997, he worked briefly at the Institute of Mathematical Sciences in 1998. Spiritually inclined, he joined the Ramakrishna Mutt as a renunciate upon being impressed by the life and work of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. His initial name was Brahmachari Brahmachaitanya. He was renamed as Swami Vidyanathananda after receiving his saffron robe on 12 January 2009. Swami Vidyanathananda is a monk at the Order's headquarters at Belur and an associate professor of mathematics at the Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda University at Belur. He has widely published and presented his research in the area of hyperbolic manifolds and ending lamination spaces. His most notable work is the proof of existence of Cannon-Thurston maps. This led to the resolution of the conjecture that connected limited sets of finitely generated Kleinian groups. He is also the author of maps on boundaries of hyperbolic metric spaces. Recently, he was awarded Bhatnagar Award in India for his contribution in mathematics. I welcome Swami Vidyanathanandaji to kindly grace the occasion.
Thank you. I realize that there is something on the web which misrepresents, and there are several inaccuracies there. So please don't take all that. Okay, so I must say that I feel very uncomfortable speaking about spiritual topics, and the essential reason why I feel very uncomfortable is that I don't know whether what I am saying is true or not. Okay, so I think, but at the same time, I wrote this to Kripamayanji when he asked me to talk on this thing. I sort of wrote back to him saying that, I feel very uncomfortable giving such talks, but at the same time, it is very difficult to say no to you. So essentially it is that. So he's put me in a spot. I must do it as best as I can. Yeah, I'm accustomed to lecturing, so I'm pretty sure people, I have mathematics by the way, so I'm pretty sure people at the back will be able to hear. Anyway, so some time back again, another monk like Kripamayanji had forced me to write some article on a theme of my choice in 2011, and it was again very difficult to say no to him. So at that point of time, I had taken the occasion to vent a lot of steam against something which I did feel pretty strongly about, and I felt strongly about it basically as a mathematician, not as a monk. Essentially a lot of focus in the name of science and religion and so on and so forth. I mean, it all started off with, I'm sorry if I offend people here, but there are books, a whole bunch of them, which claim to say that Western science and Eastern mysticism are talking about the same thing, which is complete rubbish. Okay. I mean, essentially any scientist worth his salt who knows how hard it is to actually do science, and by science I mean it in the broadest possible sense, knows this, and then make some loose philosophical statement and say, oh, this is actually, this kind of scientific statement is nonsense. So I had concluded that article by saying that any genuine synthesis has to be an inquiry into something that defines all of us as human beings. And one aspect of that definitely is that we are fond, we have a dedication to truth in its deepest sense, because so therefore any genuine kind of environment, science as a human endeavor has started off as a pursuit of truth. I mean, that's the fundamental value that guides it. So, what is true and what is not. And therefore, any such genuine synthesis, if it has to come about, has to inquire into what exactly does truth mean and why do we as human beings seek it. Okay. So, this is the place where I had concluded that article, and I thought that this was one occasion in which I can force myself to think about this particular question I had raised, and therefore it was more a sort of an occasion again to force myself to think about this issue, to which both as somebody standing here and as a mathematician I am definitely committed to. So that is my apology for sort of wasting your time for 45 minutes of this Sunday morning, and therefore I'll proceed with that. Okay, because again we are standing here and the same thing can be talked about, in a pretty secular language. We don't have to really bring in religious connotations, but at a certain level I don't see, if you regard religion in its highest reach also as a human endeavor, science as a human endeavor, then it doesn't really make much sense to put all these things in various watertight compartments. So today I shall sort of draw various supporting statements, concepts from where we are. Okay. So my initial topic was what is truth and why do we as human beings seek it. So that was shortened to why truth. Like any inquiry, this question of why brings up naturally the two other sort of very closely related questions. One is what I've said, what, and the other is how. Okay. So if I am to sort of revise, finally when I thought it through, started thinking it through, it's sort of, I should probably revise the header of this talk and call it sort of truth, what, why, how. Okay? And these are sort of attempts, just an attempt, and you are free to make your own attempts, but I'll attempt to answer these questions to some extent. So, then one basically needs to look at the word, right? Typically, the meaning of a word is related to how it sort of comes into existence. And there I found that probably the etymology would be sort of very convenient to get at if we go back to Sanskrit. And the translation is Satya, right? So, but then where does this word Satya come from? And it comes from, all Sanskrit words are derived from some kind of a verb root. It's called a dhatu. And it comes from this word us. And us, sat, anyway, and then it's Satya. So that us literally means isness. In some sense, so that which is. Okay. So, and that's, if you translate truth that way, I think it's not much of a hassle to sort of understand that that's really what we mean by truth. That which is. Okay, so we start off with that. So, but that which is, to be understood in what sense? To be understood in terms of, whatever we assess as the truth about some object X is what X is in its own nature. So an explanation of that thing without or with a minimum of extra things that we impose on it based on our opinions, colorings, prejudices. So that which a thing is independent or with a minimum of subjective superpositions. So, typically what we say is, what is the objective truth? Yeah. So, what this sort of brings in that connotation also. Objective means that it is, again, independent of, I see this color as black, all of you see this color as black. So it's objective in the sense that all of us do not differ on it. Yeah? But is it really possible to get at objective facts? And so I think the practical way of verifying objectivity is some kind of universality. So we all sort of look at the world in terms of our senses. So that which is universal in terms of our sense reaction is really what we regard as true. If somebody makes a statement, should be verifiable in principle by all others. That really is what truth is about. I'll just make a slight difference here between these two notions, objectivity and universality. Objectivity typically, I would sort of tentatively describe objectivity as universality as conditioned by senses. Yeah. Why? Because it comes from the word object, and the word object means something that is sort of outside of us. Yeah. On the other hand, the word universal has a larger connotation. So for instance, when we interact with other human beings, we sort of credit them with thoughts, feelings, sort of akin to ours. These are thoughts and feelings are not something you can see. But we sort of assume that it's something that is universal in the human experience. So I would say that universal is a larger word, and objective is a specific aspect of that, conditioned by the means of acquiring raw data from the universe, namely our senses. Okay, so I have spent some amount of time on the what question. We'll sort of keep on probing, coming back to this again and again. Question is, why do we seek it? And again, that is connected with this root etymological thing, that which is. That which is Sat is connected with the notion of permanence. If somebody says that, so that thing is there and you go and see it's not there. So then it was sort of there in your mind for a while, and then you go and see it's not there. It's not something that one is particularly happy doing, right? So the reason why we seek truth, say for instance, a particular drug, let's go to a slightly more sophisticated example. A particular drug is supposed to cure a bunch of people. Yeah? And then there are lots of tests. This I'll come back to a little later, the testing process. But then finally a conclusion is arrived at which claims that a particular drug across the board, which means independent of the human being, will cure a certain disease. Now, if that is not something that is permanent, then if it cures today and does not cure tomorrow, then such a drug will be of no use. So we really trust the scientist or whoever has discovered this thing, and then the process of verification, he or she is speaking the truth, which means it is some permanent fact independent of our perception that is being given, and therefore if I suffer from a particular symptom and I consume this drug, it will cure me. So I think this notion of why is also answered by the content of the word, in the sense that we are sort of seeking something that is not conditioned by time, individual prejudice, etc., etc. Now the how question. How do we know that something is true? And I sort of mentioned it briefly just some 1 minute back. Essentially there are tests carried out. Okay? So, which means some statement that resists inquiry. Somebody claims that a certain drug cures, then there are tests. There are sort of placebo tests. So, for example, you take two medicines which look very similar. One of them does not have an active ingredient, the other does. And then you let it be tested on a bunch of patients. These are called double-blind tests, where neither the person giving the medication nor the person receiving it knows whether this is a placebo or whether it genuinely contains a drug. Then you obtain statistical data out of that, how effective it is. Once it is tested out, that data is something that can be put on the public platform and people can verify it for themselves. So I think this notion of how do you know that something is true has to be verified by inquiry. Either individual, but if we went on testing various things, if a child had to test that when the parents tell him that, look, if you put your hand into fire, you'll get it burned, I don't think any child would survive to give the evidence of his inquiry, right? So, therefore, we sort of take for granted what people who are supposed to be speaking the truth are telling us as a practical alternative to having to verify everything. On the other hand, that is why when somebody has actually fooled us, there was, in the scientific world, all this sort of keeps coming up, something about cold fusion, way of generating a lot of energy, and various things, superconductivity, which would sort of say things like that all the electricity bills that we pay are no longer necessary, essentially. Yeah. So, there are hoaxes that keep coming up. There is definitely, there are versions of superconductivity that do exist, but not in these terms. So there have been hoaxes, and then one distills out what really is true, what really is independent of a person's observation. And it is this process of inquiry that is the how of truth. Okay. Now, since we are here, let's sort of try to find out, is there a similar ground for inquiry into religious facts or statements? And I believe there is. So this is just a belief, and I will just quote or narrate a couple of incidents. So you just heard one story from Sri Ramakrishna's life, and that reaction to somebody taking something as trivial as a bunch of greens without another person's knowledge and taking it seriously, really it stems from an individual's subjective commitment to truth. Because when we talk about a person of integrity, it means that that person is committed to something. Yeah. What that something is has a range, but whether he is really true to that conviction is tested out by his actions. That's the laboratory. This world is the laboratory so people who have integrity are people we sort of depend on. Okay, yeah, this chap is not going to fool us. So that little incident there brings out that particular aspect of this individual human being. And when this man was, we typically think of him as one devotee who sings and dances and gets into all kinds of moods. But after a prolonged period of time of doing his ritualistic worship, meditating, etc., this question, and this is also narrated in the Great Master, this question arose in his mind: is this image I am meditating on, is it real or is it just a poet's imagination? Yeah. And if it is just a piece of poetry, just somebody's imagination, then there's no point in carrying this out. You see, it's precisely this inquiry which is what exactly is true behind this image. That's what this how sort of manifests in this individual's life. And this query has to come to us at various points of time, because otherwise just silencing doubts is not going to work, because they're going to lurk inside and they have to be tested and verified. And I would go so far as to say that God has to be put to the test. Yeah. Without that, there is no, why is one religious then? If there is no sort of permanence in this notion that we are pursuing in the name of religion, and if there is no truth in it, then it's better to discard it. So, that came to him at that point of time, and therefore and even later on, when he was doing his Advaita sadhana under Totapuri, he was told that, look, this image that you are attracted to is not the final word. There is, what reality is there is not conditioned by that particular image. It's a particular conditioning. Therefore, deconditioning or sort of trying to get at a notion of universal subjectivity is something that his inquiry, what is real behind this form? And he sort of describes it in very simple terms. He says, I used knowledge or discrimination as a sword and cut that image. It vanished. Essentially, the point is for a person to have loved very completely and wholeheartedly a particular manifestation of what we call divine or divinity. And then when the situation really demands and he realizes that, okay, this is one particular image, but what the reality that this image stands for is something more permanent. It's not something that is conditioned by the image. Essentially something, in Vedantic terms, defining us as human beings. Therefore, the inquiry was made, and he removed that one image which he had sort of loved above everything else, and in order to get at the truth. Okay, so even though it is generally interpreted mystically, I think we can sort of try to understand it in very common sense human terms. From Vivekananda's, there's this one lecture on Maya and freedom, and I'll sort of say that what exactly this religious urge is in this particular context, and what he says about it. And he says religion begins with a tremendous dissatisfaction with the present state of things, with our lives, and a hatred, an intense hatred for this patching up of life, an unbounded disgust for fraud and lies. He alone can be religious who dares say, as the mighty Buddha once said under the bo tree, when this idea of practicality appeared before him and he saw that it was nonsense, and yet could not find a way out. When the temptation came to him to give up his search after truth, to go back to the world and live the old life of fraud, calling things by wrong names, telling lies to oneself and to everybody, he, the giant, conquered it and said, death is better than a vegetating, ignorant life. It is better to die on the battlefield than to live a life of defeat. This is the basis of religion. So, real religion does not consist of subscribing to a bunch of theological dogmas, but it is a subjective quest, inquiry, into finding something that we value. And the value is based on its permanence, on its truth. Okay, so I have sort of dwelt on the what question, and I will come back to it. And some of you might sort of see that behind all this, again, we are sort of dwelling on certain three things which we keep on, three words which we keep using, probably without thinking about what they mean. Sat as existence, Chit as knowledge, and Ananda as bliss, joy. What exactly does it mean? And essentially what I'm trying to say here is that any higher human pursuit, and I would not distinguish so much between something that is called religious and something that is not. If you really have to categorize, it's a seeking of one of these three things in some fundamental form. And this is not a particularly Oriental concept. If you go back to Plato, there is this three trichotomy: the good, the true, the beautiful. Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at various higher human endeavors, seeking for good, whatever it means, results in social work in its broadest sense. Seeking the truth results in science as a human endeavor, and seeking beauty results in art as a human endeavor. I mean, that this was sort of this is the Western paradigm, and we call it Satchitananda, and etc. Again, these three things, because these are aspects of things which define us as human beings, it's not possible to compartmentalize. So, I mean, as soon as you realize that there is something that is universal, then even the discovery of a drug and making it available has this aspect of goodness about it. Why? Because a scientific discovery is meant to be available to human beings, independent of what their calling, what their particular personal colorings are. So it is this notion of universality that truth seeks, coupled with the recognition that the benefits of such an inquiry should be in principle available to all human beings, ties the inquiry into truth up with the notion of goodness. So evidently Sri Ramakrishna thought that this inquiry into a quest for God was something that is worthwhile, his quest for truth. And therefore at the end of it, he did not regard himself as somebody who was specially privileged with this, and that the other people will not derive its benefits. So therefore, when I think the severest inquiry that he was subjected to was from Vivekananda. And I think when he asked him about this, he said, yeah, I have tested it out, and I have accepted. I know that it is true, and it's not something that is special to me, it's available to you too. So in that sense, it's the antithesis of the notion of a classical priest who sort of regards himself as a particularly specially privileged intermediary who holds himself in some position of superiority and really uses that as an excuse for, dare I say, fooling other people for personal benefit. So there's this notion of universality and making one's discoveries open to all and available to all, so that all human beings can derive benefit from it, is precisely how the inquiry into truth naturally leads to goodness as a fundamental human value. So goodness is that which benefits, and we'll take as this as the definition, that which benefits all human beings, and therefore it needs to be, it needs to be defined in terms of universal human experiences. So, this is not something that is abstract. Recognizing fundamental human rights as an individual is something that's a very secular, very universal pursuit today. Okay, so let's come back to this how process. And so if the seeking is of permanence, how does one do it? Objectively, we've sort of seen how it is done, in the sense that you have various labs, experiments are done to verify whether something is true or not, whether something is not conditioned by subjective prejudices or not. But in the religious field, what is the dimension of such an inquiry? And I think it's not something, it's something that's in some sense much harder, because as human beings we are not just people who are after some kind of an intellectual truth, but it's something that needs to be experienced in our individual lives, not in any mystical sense, but in a very clear, down-to-earth, practical sense. And I think the raw material for our human experiences are our feelings, emotions, etc. And seeking of permanence there in the emotive aspect of man, that which brings us joy, is really what leads to this notion of devotion. Bhakti, whatever. And it's sort of distilling from our various human experiences that which is permanent. And I mean, human relations, in as much as they are permanent, are sources of satisfaction to us. Yeah. In as much, which means they cannot possibly be permanent, but in as much as they are not conditioned by the passage of time, or there is some substratum which is long lasting. So they would be of value to us. So I think this notion of devotion is really a process of distilling subjectively from our human emotions, the dross, the things which are less permanent, and leaving us with aspects of, with that aspect of pure joy as a permanent possession, which really means that we arrive at, again, the third defining aspect of a human being, which is its capacity to feel joy and love, as a permanent aspect of one's being. Okay. Now, we sort of dwelt on the human being throughout this, because that's what we really sort of deal with in our day-to-day life. Where does the notion of God fit into all this? And I think the notion of God also keeps evolving. So it's, I would take a purely human notion that the notion of God is constructed by human beings based on their understanding of themselves. Yeah? So it's a seeking of an ideal which keeps evolving. So I think the ancients, who were a warlike race, by and large sort of fighting with each other over territory, they had a god which was at times pretty cruel, jealous, violent, and would favor a particular tribe over another. So somehow or the other we think that, that's a very adolescent god. Yeah, right. Does not mean that we've gotten rid of violence in us, but we would like to get rid of violence. We are living in a world which is, it's not safe. I think the Second World War ended with destruction of a lot of human life, and then it was followed by 30 years of tension between two states which found this discovery of science, the nuclear power, a source of enormous power, and therefore, if not harnessed, a possible source of complete destruction. So all human beings, all gods, everything destroyed. Yeah? So therefore, I think certainly post-World War II, believing in a violent God that favors me, particularly when I decide to take life of other people. It's not it seems like a very puerile, adolescent notion of God, and such a God should be put in the reformatory. Okay, so, but if we define it in terms of sort of this aspect of what are our higher human pursuits, and it is in some sense what we do is we project this subjective ideal onto something outside, because we typically gain knowledge, gain information through our interactions with the world, and therefore we sort of tend to project it outside. But really it is something subjective, something within, but not subjective in the sense of something which is affected by prejudice, but something that is really universal. So therefore, each organized religion sort of puts various constructs around this common human urge for three basic things: permanence, knowledge or truth, and love or joy. And then there are various social constructs which one puts around it, and that is called a church or a temple or a mosque, or whatever. Yeah? But if you abstract it from this particular social setup in which this thing has various significances, because typically one would say that no, if you don't wave the light 4 times, you are committing a grave sin. All kinds of silly things which no person who thinks for himself or herself would possibly accept as anything other than child's babble. So therefore, it is a notion of trying to get at this notion of a subjective ideal, which is not unreal. I mean, it's pretty real in the sense that all of us are striving for something, and it is this enquiry of what do I really want out of my life, out of my existence, that leads to this notion. And it's the notion of permanence within that, a seeking of all human beings for a certain permanence, that leads to all these notions of rebirth, etc., etc., etc. I mean, whether rebirth is there or not is really an irrelevant question. I mean, today I don't know whether I was born earlier or not. It's not something. What does it mean to be reborn? I mean, this body is certainly died, it's cremated or it's buried. So this body certainly does not something. I mean, in 7 years, all cells of the body except the neurons change. So there is certainly, it's not this body. This is a certain notion. Our human senses are not finely tuned enough to perceive these changes. And therefore, this notion of permanence is something that we associate with the body without realizing that this notion of permanence is something that is subjective. So it's a human notion. I will not call it just a feeling, because it's something that is a substratum of all our experience, because it's that which makes one remember stuff that one has learnt in one's childhood all through. So that is this seeking. I think there's one more aspect of, and it's related to the last thing that I'll come to. Good. Okay, so it's almost over. So this notion of permanence. There's one other thing. When we interact with the world, it is not merely in terms of knowledge gained, or cognitive aspect, not just in terms of our emotive aspect. There's a third aspect, which is essentially how we change the world around us. Yeah? So which means what is called conative, or the aspect of will of an individual. And it is this notion of will that is there in us. I mean, I can have a choice to move this up or down. So I can influence the world around me. And then you abstract that out and universalize it. And then you have this notion of an all-powerful God. Personally, I don't have much sympathy for that, because just power for its own sake has given rise to a lot of violence in this world. And I think one of my favorite scientists sort of described that this is a notion of God as the supreme fascist. Okay, so, I mean, it's not something that, okay, one has to sort of abjectly bow down to that somebody else has power over me, etc., etc. I think all of this is the consequence of this human interaction with the world. As soon as I even move this object exerts a pressure back. I mean, the Newton's third law, I think, is really at the basis of the fact that we are not all powerful. Therefore, there is a reaction. And no individual can exercise his will over other individuals. And this is, so I think when we, so there are sort of two things. One is people who sort of seek a freedom from being imposed upon by the world. And it is really extricating. So that's the will being used to extricate the individual from things that condition it, demand of it, various things in the world, that results in this quest for freedom. And the democratic urge, really, in countries, in social structures today, really is based on the recognition that every individual has certain rights to freedom that I myself would like of myself. Okay. So therefore, whimsical God sitting above the clouds, ruling people's destinies. Again, I think it's something that lies in between the primitive form and where we are today. Therefore, and that is not a kind of God I would like to personally believe in. I mean, as an individual who sort of arbitrarily rules. But if you look at it as a union of all human capacities or various choices that anybody can make, collective choices, then that means this abstract notion of will concretized is what we regard as all-powerful. I mean, okay, so what is, and that will sort of bring us to some kind of a solipsistic definition. I mean, solipsistic definition, essentially we want to exert power over various things. This notion of all that can exercise power is that particular aspect of a personal power. So it's sort of generalizing from our understanding of ourselves to a certain universal notion. Finally, let us sort of, again, so we are trying to find out, again, the notion of truth in the domain of religion, and we are subjecting the human notion of a personal God to that inquiry. Yeah? So I think the first thing we sort of said was this notion of a concept of God evolves. And this, by the way, I mean, this is sort of based, I suppose, personally on again another lecture of Swamiji's here, which calls it Maya and the evolution of the concept of God. It's there in volume 2. So, and of course, part of the intention is to provoke some kind of reaction. So I mean, it's sort of inquiring of ourselves. So it starts off with a violent, crude, warmongering God, and that is sort of said, okay, fine, we've grown up before that. That cannot possibly be an ideal. Second thing is, can we think of an all-powerful God sitting above the heavens, ruling all our destinies? This is just a slight refinement of that notion, because it's not that much of a difference. Alright, fine, so we won't say that this fellow is some arbitrary, jealous, cruel guy who rules us like a despot. But what about merely as a creator. Yeah. So something that creates various things. Firstly, this notion of a creator God is based on, again, a human notion that anything that we create, the food that people have prepared, some human agent is necessary, and therefore anything that has come into existence has to have been created. Therefore, this world that we see all around us, generalization of that notion of a very specific thing, creation of one dish of raita by one individual cook, therefore means that there is somebody who has cooked and prepared this world. Yeah. So I am a pure mathematician, so we have this joke amongst us. So what was God doing before creation? And the answer we gave is that he was doing pure mathematics. Then he decided to do some applied mathematics and look at the mess. Okay, so I mean, this is sort of our standing joke between when pure mathematicians and applied mathematicians fight. They sort of have all these jokes at each other's expense. So anyway, they in turn call us that you guys do something that is completely useless, and yeah, etc., etc. That's going to take us away. So this notion of a creator God, then we sort of see that okay, anything that we do has a cause, and therefore the universe has a cause. This is a jump which is not quite clear. Yeah? And I'll try to say where exactly scientifically this notion really breaks down. I mean, all this is sort of a way of, what is it? I mean, sort of removing certain accretions that have accumulated on, okay, so this is perhaps at a certain level a purely personal exercise. This is a disclaimer I had said at the very beginning. And therefore, if we do not understand a God in clear human terms, it's not something that's going to ever become real to us. I mean, it's just going to be a bunch of mystical formulae, some set routines that we follow without really sort of making it real in our life. So, so why is this notion of creation such a problematic thing? And really this notion of creation pervades a lot of theology. Theology really means it's a theory constructed out of a positive God for this universe. Today, I would like to ask something. It says, suppose you have a headache. What do? You go and take a paracetamol, right? Do you pray to God for that headache to be removed? No. So which means that we have greater faith in paracetamol than a God to remove our headache, right? I think there is no harm in it. Why? Because this paracetamol, what is it based on? It is based on a bunch of tests. Therefore, it is based on truth. And therefore, if we regard God as this quest of human beings for God as synonymous as a human quest for truth, goodness, beauty, there is no contradiction. Yeah. It is the problem lies precisely when we say, oh, this fellow is all powerful, sitting in, he commands this headache, he is going to do all kinds of hocus pocus upstairs above the clouds which we have no information of, and my headache is going to go up. And this is precisely this kind of tendency that keeps leading us to expect all kinds of miracles, which makes our mind soft. And very often, it also gives rise to very dangerous notions that we are particularly favored of God. Therefore, he centers his whole business around me. It's a very puerile kind of thing. So let's subject the Creator God to this test. So what does the notion of creation come in subsume? It means that something preceded something in time. Correct? And time, see, if you say that this is some three-dimensional space we live in, there is no way of saying that in dimension 3, this mic here precedes that mic there. Right? It's a three-dimensional thing. You can't say it. As soon as you have more than one dimension, nothing is before something or after something. It's one dimension that has this notion of before and after. And time is something that is definitely one dimensional. There is a way of saying that something is before, something is after. Okay. So what does the notion of creation mean? It means that there was this time zero. Correct? If you take this present time and you sort of trace it back further and further back in time, then you would have somehow at some point of time gotten to the beginning of time. Yeah? So the notion of Creator God is based on this human perception of time as one-dimensional, cause and effect relationship, therefore something at time zero. Yeah? And that something at time zero, beyond time, is what we call the Creator God. I'll just give some vague things. I am not a physicist, but I think there are certain very testable experiments which say that the universe is expanding. Expanding at a pretty fast rate. So how will we sort of go to that beginning of time? And really I think the most sincere inquirers into the notion of a creator God, I think, are the high energy physicists. Okay? Much more serious about their inquiry than we religious people or mathematicians or people in other areas. So what do? So they take this expansion and run it backwards. This was done by a couple of physicists long back. I mean, this is where it all started. Stephen Hawking, I'm pretty sure people have heard of, and Roger Penrose. Anyway, so you run it backwards. If you run it backwards, then so you are presumably, if you take this present thing and look at the trajectory back, this trajectory is going to converge to all mass, all space, converging to a point, some certain number of billion years back. Okay, that is fine. So then that particular point is, it's called this Big Bang and various other things. But that also, when you subject it to further, even scientific inquiry, that point zero does not resist the test of inquiry. I mean, I think it's some 10 power minus 34 seconds, or maybe even slightly less, maybe 10 power minus some larger number, is where this notion of space-time is this 3 plus 1, 3 space dimensions, 1 time dimension, all this mass, it sort of breaks down. Why? Because at the scale of 10 power minus 34, what are called quantum effects come into existence. So the notion of time as a one-dimensional object cannot be extended beyond a certain thing. Why? Because these theories of physics which deal with large-scale phenomena here are no longer valid at that level. So therefore, what we really need to be asking ourselves is, what is it in the human experience that leads us to this notion of a creator God? And I think we have concluded that essentially it's the linearity of time, one-dimensionality of time that leads us to it. Therefore, the more fundamental question really means, what is this notion of time? This is now a scientific question. Yeah, something that we can really address without any theological baggage. Does it have a subjective religious counterpart? And really, it is precisely this change in time that leads to this notion of impermanence. So, if we can somehow subjectively get over this human notion of time, then I think we would have found some kind of what we really aspire after as permanence. Yeah? And do we have it in our subjective experience? I think we do. And what is it? We go to sleep every day. Yeah? And then if you are in a dream, then there are various things, flying, falling, etc., etc. I mean, all things that sort of, but that is still, I mean, it's a mental reaction. I mean, there is a sort of a linearity of events, and this spacing out of events does lead us to this notion of time there. But then we fall into dreamless sleep. Right? where dreams are not there. The subjective experience is then something that is not conditioned by time. Can we catch hold of that experience? And I think this whole business of trying to practice meditation, etc., quieting the mind, not quieting the mind but stamping it down. If that was the purpose, then all that we would need to do is go into deep sleep. That's all. Sometimes in meditation secretly I also do. Okay. But that's not the purpose. So I think the real purpose of meditation is to get at this aspect of the human mind which is not conditioned by thought. And therefore this various religious practices, if you sort of remove from it various theological organized religion accretions, then you get at something that is universal in the human experience. And the inquiry into truths then leads one to these various inquiries and leads us to that. At that level, the human pursuit of art, social work, science, and the religious urge, if you define it in pure subjective human terms, it does not have that much of contradiction. So I'll just conclude by reading out again. So by reading out from the same essay of lecture of Swami. So that the assertion of freedom is there, that the gods whom human beings, worship are superior to nature as he knows it. So with those who worship still higher beings, as the idea of nature expands, the idea of the soul, which is some aspect of the human being, which is superior to nature, that which inquires, also expands, until we come to the position of what we call monotheism, which holds that there is Maya, nature, and that there is some being who is the ruler of Maya. There is some fellow sitting above the clouds. And then he says, here Vedanta begins, where these monotheistic ideas first appear. But the Vedanta philosophy wants further explanation. This explanation that there is a being beyond all these manifestations of Maya who is superior to and independent of Maya and who is attracting us towards himself and that we are all going towards him is very good, says the Vedanta, but yet the perception is not clear. The vision is dim and hazy, although it does not directly contradict reason. Just as in your hymn it is said, nearer my God to thee, the same hymn would be very good to the Vedantin, only he would change a word and make it nearer my God to me. The idea that the goal is far off, far beyond nature, attracting us all towards it, has to be brought nearer and nearer without degrading or degenerating it. The God of heaven becomes the God in nature, and the God in nature becomes the God who is nature, and the God who is nature becomes the God within the temple of the body, and the God dwelling in the temple of the body at last becomes the temple itself, becomes the soul and man, and there it reaches the last words it can teach. He whom the sages have been seeking in all these places is in our own hearts,